Dobar dan kolegice i kolege, hvala vam na dolasku nakon sastanka u Banskim dvorima. Slijednici za medije, predsjednika Andreja Plenkovića, glavnog tajnika NATO-a i ministra Stoltenberg. Uvodno ću zamoliti predsjednika vlade Andreja Plenkovića da se
Mr. Stoltenberg. Mr. Prime Minister, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome once again Mr. Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, who is today again visiting Croatia. As you know, the occasion for his meeting this time is the informal meeting of the defense ministers of EU, the meeting to which Croatia is a host. Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defense Damir Krstičević will be presiding of this meeting today and tomorrow, which will be followed by informal meeting of foreign ministers, which is going to be transformed also into formal meeting, and the most topical security challenges and crises are going to be discussed, which were also the topic of the meeting today with the Secretary General, and that meeting together with the High Representative Borrell is going to be chaired by our Foreign Minister Grlić. Today we discussed the activities of Croatia within the North Atlantic Alliance. As you know, we are now at our 11th year of our membership. We are a responsible ally, the country which contributes to many international missions. A total of 440 troops, Croatian troops are members of different missions, NATO missions or international allied missions or EU missions. So when we compare the number of our troops, Croatian army, we are giving significant contribution to global peace and security. In particular, we discussed the current situation related to potential migration crisis. Given the visit in which I participated yesterday together with Mr. Charles Michel, President of the European Council, Madam von der Leyen, President of the Commission, and the President of the European Parliament, David Sassoli, invited by Kyriakos Mitsotakis, the Croatian Prime Minister, we were able to see with our own eyes what is the situation like in East Greece. East of Greece in the region called Evros, along the Evros River, and in particular at the border crossing in Kastanjes. We saw with our own eyes what the situation was there like. We discussed this. We agreed that at the level of EU, but also at the level of many EU member states and also NATO, that there is a strong and clear position that illegal migration must be prevented, that people should not be abused, the people that are already in a very difficult situation as refugees or migrants who are at this moment at the territory of Turkey, they should not be led to think that they think that the borders are open when they are not open. We should not provoke additional humanitarian difficulties and crises. At any stake, Croatia, which has experience with a major migration in 2015-2016, we believe it is important to prevent such situations, since we are among the countries that are along the East Mediterranean West Balkan route, in cooperation with other members and in cooperation with EU and of course NATO, we will try to prevent the new migration wave. And at this moment, Minister Božinović is presiding as we speak over the extraordinary meeting of internal ministers in Brussels. The second topic was relating to the situation in Afghanistan after the agreement signed a couple of days ago on 29 February, I believe, and also we discussed the NATO preparations for gradual dephasing operations of decisive support operations. We heard information from Secretary General, and in accordance with that, we will adopt the presence of Croatian troops at the time ahead of us. In this operation, we also informed Secretary General thereof. Everything else, what was else discussed, our presence in the mission in Iraq. Again, we have 7 members. This is functioning well. Members of Croatian Army are performing at a high level of contribution. This has been so for many years. We have also shortly discussed the forthcoming activities, the cooperation between EU and NATO, the major major conference is going to be held in June here. The Deputy Secretary General will attend, and one conference about military mobility, which is going to be held at the beginning of May in Brussels. It would be a pleasure if the Secretary General would participate. So this was in a nutshell. Thank you. Thank you, Prime Minister. Now Secretary General, Mr. Stoltenberg, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Prime Minister Andrej Plenković. It's great to be back in Zagreb and great to meet with you again. And Croatia is a highly valued ally, and you contribute to our shared security in many different ways and to different NATO missions and operations. You are contributing troops to NATO's forward presence in Poland and Lithuania. You are part of our missions in Afghanistan, in Kosovo and Iraq. And we also welcome the role you play working with the partners in the Western Balkan region. We also welcome the fact that Croatia has increased defense spending and that you have a clear commitment to meet the guideline of spending 2% of GDP on defense. We have just discussed the historic opportunity for peace in Afghanistan. And as you mentioned, I was in Kabul with President Ghani and US Defense Secretary Esper to welcome the signature of the framework agreement. This is an opportunity to open negotiations among Afghans and achieve sustainable peace. In order to take that opportunity, the Taliban must honor their commitments. We need to see a reduction in violence and avoid undermining the agreement. NATO remains committed to Afghanistan's security and stability, and we will continue to support the Afghan security forces with funding and with training. I welcome Croatia's commitment and contributions to our rescue support mission. We also discussed the crisis in Syria and its impact for NATO allies and EU member states. We agree the situation is highly complex, challenging and volatile. We condemn the indiscriminate bombing by the Assad regime and Russia. They have worsened the horrendous suffering of Syrian civilians and increased the movement of refugees towards Turkey, which already hosts nearly 4 million refugees. Greece is also severely impacted by the current situation. I recently spoke with the Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis. Greece carries a heavy burden, and the challenges of migration are shared challenges which require shared solutions. NATO's deployment in the Aegean Sea remains important, but the international community needs to address the root causes of the crisis. We need to see a political solution to the conflict in Syria, so the Assad regime and Russia must end their offensive, respect international law, and support UN efforts for a peaceful solution. We also addressed the security situation in the Western Balkans. NATO remains fully committed to stability and security in the region. Croatia plays a key role. You are a champion of NATO's open door policy, and I appreciate your strong political support for the accession of North Macedonia. This process is on track, and in the coming weeks I look forward to welcoming North Macedonia as NATO's 30th member state. So Prime Minister, let me congratulate you on the presidency of the Council of the European Union. The security challenges we face are too complex for any one nation or organization to face alone. So therefore, it is important that we continue to strengthen the cooperation between NATO and the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we can hear questions. Miro Asić.
Rekli ste da se Hrvatska obvezala na izdvajanje troškova od 2% BDP-a za obranu. Tražite to i od drugih članica. Koliko je to zaista potrebno? Koliko to pridonosi na neki način militarizaciji Europe? Pogotovo ako ne znamo ko je stvarno neprijatelj. NATO saveza. To pitanje također postavio, podsjetit ću, i francuski predsjednik Emmanuel Macron, koji je kazao kako to nije ni Rusija ni Kina, već globalni terorizam.
He said, this is not Russia, this is not China, this is global terrorism. The global terrorism is the enemy. Thank you.
We are faced with many threats and many challenges, and NATO doesn't have the luxury of choosing either to focus on one or the other. We have to be able to respond to all of them at the same time. We are stepping up in the fight against international terrorism. That's the reason why we, for instance, are stepping up our presence in Iraq to make sure that ISIS is never able to return. That's also the reason why we are in Afghanistan. We have to remember that we are in Afghanistan to protect ourselves. To prevent Afghanistan from once again becoming a platform for preparing, training, organizing terrorist attacks against our countries, as they did in 9/11/2001 against the United States. And therefore it is important that we make sure that the caliphate ISIS lost in Syria and Iraq is not re-established in Afghanistan. So NATO is fighting terrorism, and we welcome Croatia's contributions to our mission in Afghanistan and our mission in Iraq. Then we are also responding to more assertive Russia. We have seen that Russia has used military force against neighbors in Georgia, but also in Ukraine, illegally annexing Crimea. That's the first time since the end of the Second World War that one country has taken apart a territory from another country by the use of force. And therefore NATO has deployed combat-ready troops to the eastern part of the alliance. This is a defensive response. This is something we do to make sure that we have credible deterrence. And the success of NATO is that as long as we are together, as long as we stand together and make sure that an attack on one ally will trigger the response from the whole alliance, we don't provoke a war, but we prevent the war. Our task is not to fight the war, but to prevent conflict. And the best way of doing that is to send a clear message of deterrence, unity of the alliance, making clear that if one ally is attacked, then the whole alliance will respond. And by doing that, we have kept peace in Europe for 70 years, and that's also the best way to maintain and preserve peace in the future.
Thank you. The second question,
Hrvoje Krešić, N1 televizija. My question goes primarily to Mr. Secretary General, but I will also appreciate thoughts of Mr. Prime Minister as well. We've been listening throughout the last several days, leaders of the European Union saying, we've heard the Prime Minister as well, saying that Turkey is basically using refugees and migrants in order to pursue its own geopolitical interests. Is there a conflict within the NATO? Because Turkey is an important NATO member state when it comes to the issue. On the other hand, Turkey is at the same time under attack by Syria and Russia as a NATO member state. Will the other NATO member states come to help? And how will the issue be resolved, especially if we take into account as well the fact that the special advisor to the President of the United States has said that the United States will help Turkey in reasonable amount of ammunition and other military help. So is there a big conflict within the NATO itself, and how can it be resolved? Thank you.
So what we see now is the consequences of the worsening of the conflict in Syria. We see that in Turkey, with more refugees coming from Syria into Turkey. And we also see the crisis on the border between Turkey and Greece. NATO plays a role in addressing that. There is fundamentally not a military solution to the crisis we see on the border between Greece and Turkey, but NATO is playing a role partly through our deployment in the Aegean Sea with ships, trying to implement or helping to implement the agreement between EU and Turkey on the migrant and refugee crisis. But NATO is also playing a role by addressing the root causes. For instance, in Afghanistan, but also in the fight against ISIS through our participation in the global coalition to defeat Daesh and our presence in Iraq. NATO is not on the ground in Syria, but some NATO allies are. And we see that the crisis, the violence there has consequences for all NATO allies and for EU member states. we condemn the Russian use of force and the use of force from the Assad regime. We have seen indiscriminate bombings, we have seen violation of international law, and we call on Russia and the regime in Damascus to fully respect international law, to stop their offensive, and to support and engage in constructive talks under UN leadership to find a peaceful negotiated solution to the crisis in Syria.
I would just like to add one important detail, important for us, what we believe, both as presiding EU Council and also as Croatia. We believe that we should go back to the statement between Turkey and EU of 2016 and re-employ everything that has been efficient in the last years. From 100% we came to 2% of intensity of migration route. We decreased intensity. We don't want to repeat the situation 4 or 5 years ago, and we appeal for dialogue. We want the talks currently held by Charles Michel in Ankara, that they are positive, that they follow this path, and our minister is also going to represent Croatia's position on this line. The question for the Prime Minister, in the last couple of days, we heard that Croatian politics is calling for army on Croatian borders, but army has only logistics role and can only assist Croatian police. Are you considering changing law and giving more authority to the army at this moment, says the Prime Minister? What we are doing as a responsible government, we are considering all scenarios. We have to be prepared for possible increased intensity. But after what I saw yesterday, after the assurances from the Greek Prime Minister, we see that the policy of this Greek government will be essentially different. If Greek-Turkey border is not going to leak, then we are not going to be faced with many threats. At the same time, Croatian police is guarding our borders. This is dominant. As responsible people, we are going to see, if necessary, how possibly members of Croatian army can assist in this process. But now, as the Minister of Defense said yesterday, this is only at the level of planning and plans B, just in case. Croatian police is here to protect Croatian borders, and Croatian army and Croatian police are here to protect Croatian interests. There is no problem to cooperate. Very often at natural disasters, you saw how important it was to have the whole system of homeland defense, how important it is to serve the purpose of what we need at each particular moment. We have to have police, civil protection, firemen, and also Croatian army. As any other service which is necessary, they have to participate. Our citizens know that they all communicate and coordinate their activities. One more question. Mr. Prime Minister, you mentioned withdrawal from Afghanistan in phases. You informed Mr. Stoltenberg about Croatian plans to
Možete li reći koji je dakle plan povlačenja hrvatske vojske iz Afganistana, dakle do kada bi se trebali povući pojedinim fazama, i pitanje za gospodina Stoltenberga, koji su plan i šta očekuje do kada bi se snage NATO-a, ako sve bude u redu i ako talibani budu poštivali mirovni sporazum, NATO mogao povući iz Afganistana? Hvala lijepo.
Prije svega mi želimo da smisao misije, odlučna potpora i opći prisutnost
of decisive support and the presence of international troops there, we want this to be efficient. This is the main reason, the main goal. We must not forget why we are, as allies, present in Afghanistan now and why we have been there for many years. This is the second mission in which we participate. And this is the message which you heard from Secretary General.
Da će doći do naglog povlačenja, sigurno nisu poruke koje jačaju poziciju, koje osiguravaju provedbu sporazuma koji je potpisan. Dakle, to je ono što je politički i strateški važno.
We have to have this in mind in
Kao što
political and
ste čuli, sam
strategic
NATO
terms.
ima plan smanjiti određeni broj ljudi u vremenu koje je pred nama. Vodit će se razgovori na političkoj razini, ali isto tako i u okviru vojnog sektora NATO-a, prije svega komunikacija našega
The communication will be held between our General Staff of Croatian Army with NATO Command in Mons, and we are going to inform the public accordingly. What has already been agreed, that the new Croatian troops contingent, 108 or 109 troops, is going to go as scheduled. They're going to go to Afghanistan. After that, in the period ahead of us, in agreement with our allies, with the Secretary General, bearing in mind that this is not a proportional horizontal downsizing of everybody by certain percentage. No, because each of us has certain specific tasks there, and we have to keep in mind that the whole mission as a whole must function, and that its tasks have to be fulfilled at the expected level, and we have to keep in mind who does what at one particular moment. But everything what we are going to do is going to be responsible in our interest, and also in the sense of our presence in Afghanistan and the purpose of our
The agreement that was signed on Saturday is a first step, and there is still a very long way to go and a difficult way to go before we have a lasting, sustainable peace settlement in Afghanistan. We welcome this as a first step. At the same time, we know that there will be these difficulties and also disappointments on the way. The important thing we achieved through the agreement was that Taliban agreed that they should break all ties with international terrorist organizations and prevent Afghanistan from once again becoming a safe haven for international terrorists. Second, they also agreed to reduction of violence. And thirdly, they agreed to sit down and start inter-Afghan negotiations. Because at the end of the day, the only way to create peace in Afghanistan is to have an Afghan-led and Afghan-owned peace process. Peace in Afghanistan cannot be created in Brussels or Washington or Zagreb. It has to be created by the Afghans themselves. We will only reduce our presence if Taliban adhere to or respect the agreement they have signed. Therefore, it is a conditions-based reduction that will take place if we see that the conditions are met. We have plans in place to gradually reduce, and as the Prime Minister said, this is not an equal proportional reduction. It will depend on different tasks, but we are ready to reduce if Taliban meet the conditions in the agreement. I think it's important that we don't now rush to the exit, because that will reduce the likelihood of the deal being implemented. Taliban has to understand that they will never win on the battlefield, that we will stay committed to the Afghan security forces, train them, assist them, advise them, and provide funding. And by doing that, we send a clear message to Taliban that they will not win on the battlefield. They have to sit down at the negotiating table and make real compromises and implement a deal. So therefore, we will stay committed. That's the best way to create the conditions for a lasting peace that will eventually enable us to leave. We went into Afghanistan together. We will make adjustments together, and eventually one day we'll also leave together, but only when the conditions are met, and only when we are sure that Afghanistan doesn't become a safe haven for international terrorists again.
Hvala puno, ovime zaključujemo konferenciju za medije. Hvala.
Thank you very much. This concludes the press conference.